The evening air hung thick with the stench of decay, a low fog curling like ghostly fingers across the ancient cobblestone streets. In the heart of a forgotten village, abandoned long ago by its inhabitants, there stood a crumbling mansion, its towering facade cracked and weathered, windows like empty eyes staring into the void. But the real horror was not the house, nor its eerie silence. It was what lay inside. At the center of the decaying foyer, bathed in the flickering light of dying candles, stood a pedestal made of black marble. Upon it rested a mask, twisted and grotesque, its surface carved with sharp angles and spiraling designs that seemed to shift in the shadows. The mask, known in whispers as *A mascara to paver*, was not just an object of horror. It was a vessel of ancient, malevolent power. Legend told that the mask was created by a mad sculptor centuries ago, using forbidden rituals to infuse the very essence of fear into its creation. It was said that anyone who dared wear the mask would be granted visions beyond the mortal plane. Visions so terrible they would drive even the most sane to madness. But like all cursed relics, its allure was irresistible. As the village succumbed to rot and the mansion fell into ruin, rumors of the mask's location spread like wildfire through the surrounding regions. Adventurers, occultists, and the foolhardy alike ventured into the forsaken mansion, drawn by promises of forbidden knowledge or unimaginable power. None returned, and yet, on this night, a figure stood at the gates of the mansion, a man named Raphael. He was no adventurer, nor a man seeking wealth. He was a desperate father, his mind clouded with grief after the mysterious death of his son. Stories had reached him about *A mascara to paver*, about how it could reveal the truth hidden from the living, even speak to the souls of the dead. With trembling hands, Raphael pushed open the rusted gates, the creak of metal echoing like a scream in the stillness. His heart raced, but it wasn't fear that fueled him, it was the hunger for answers. The mansion loomed before him, its doors cracked open as if welcoming him. Inside, the air was suffocating, the silence broken only by the faint sound of his footsteps on the dusty floorboards. The walls were lined with portraits, their eyes following him as he ventured deeper into the decaying halls, as if the long-dead residents were silently warning him to turn back. But Raphael pressed on, his mind focused on the mask. It wasn't long before he reached the grand foyer. The air grew colder, and the dim light of the candles seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And there, atop the marble pedestal, it waited. The mask seemed to glow faintly, as though alive, its eyes dark voids that beckoned him closer. His breath hitched as he approached, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But grief overpowered fear. Without a second thought, Raphael reached for the mask, his fingers grazing the cold, smooth surface. The moment his hand touched it, a searing pain shot through his skull, a deep, primal agony that knocked him to his knees. But he couldn't let go. His fingers curled around the mask, his vision blurring as whispers filled the room, soft at first, like distant echoes, but soon growing louder, more frantic. The voices of the dead. Put it on. His pulse pounded in his ears as he raised the mask to his face, the cold metal biting into his skin. His heart stilled for a moment, the world falling into an eerie silence. Then, with a swift motion, Raphael placed the mask over his face. The second it touched him, everything changed. The air grew thick with the stench of blood. The room twisted, the walls melting like wax, revealing the horrors that had been hidden for centuries. Figures, pale and gaunt, clawed at the walls, spirits of those who had fallen victim to the mask. Their faces were contorted in eternal terror, mouths frozen in silent screams, their eyes pleading for release. Raphael tried to scream, but no sound came out. His skin felt as though it were being peeled away, layer by layer, his mind fracturing as visions of death and suffering flooded his senses. He could see his son, standing before him, but his face was twisted in pain, blood pouring from his eyes and mouth. Why? Father? The boy's voice echoed in Raphael's mind. Why did you abandon me? Terror clawed at Raphael's soul, but he couldn't tear the mask away. His son's face dissolved into a blur of agonized spirits, victims of the mask, all howling, their voices merging into a cacophony of madness. Then came the laughter, deep, guttural, and mocking. It wasn't human. It was the mask itself, feeding on his terror, his anguish. "You wanted answers," the voice growled. "Now you will know them all. Every horror, every fear. Forever." Raphael's mind shattered as his vision blackened, the mansion fading into oblivion, leaving him alone in a world of darkness, a world where his worst nightmares had become his eternal reality. The mansion's walls trembled with the weight of Raphael's agony, though outside, all remained still. The fog thickened around the mansion, as if the world outside recoiled from the evil festering within. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments. Time itself was warped here, distorted by the malevolence of the mask. Raphael's mind, now trapped in the abyss of *a mascara to paver *, spiraled through endless cycles of torment. His son's face, grotesquely deformed, flickered in and out of focus, sometimes twisted with sorrow, other times with rage. His voice was no longer the soft whisper of the child Raphael remembered. It was a screech, a wail that cut through him like shards of glass, burrowing into his mind. "You could have saved me." The boy's voice hissed, echoing from all directions. "But you were too weak." Raphael clutched at his skull, nails digging into his flesh as if he could claw the visions out. But there was no escape. The mask had bonded with him, fusing to his very soul. He could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and the mask's began. It fed off his fear, relishing every moment of his suffering. In the real world, his body convulsed on the mansion's floor, his hands now trembling claws that twitched and jerked uncontrollably. Blood trickled from beneath the mask, soaking into his clothes. But Raphael no longer felt the pain of his physical form. His consciousness was drowning in a sea of horrors, each wave worse than the last. The mask whispered again, its voice cruel and ancient. "You wanted to know the truth, Raphael. But the truth is never what we expect. It chuckled, a sound that reverberated in the very bones of the house. Raphael's vision cleared for a moment, and he found himself in a darkened room. The air was stifling, and the walls seemed to pulse like the inside of a living thing. Chains hung from the ceiling, rusted and caked with something darker than rust. At the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface cracked and smeared with grime. But when Raphael looked into it, he saw not himself, but his son. His boy's eyes were hollow pits, his mouth sewn shut, and behind him, shadows writhed like living creatures, their long fingers reaching for him. Suddenly, the boy's mouth burst open, stitches ripping apart, and blood poured from the wound. His scream echoed through the room, but it was cut short by the mask's cruel laughter. There is no salvation. The mask taunted. Only more suffering. Meanwhile, far from the cursed mansion, stories of *a mascara to paver continued to spread. Some dismissed it as folklore, a mere ghost story to frighten the gullible. Others, however, took the whispers seriously, occultists and collectors who knew the true history of the mask and sought it for themselves. It was said that the mask held unimaginable power, visions of the future, knowledge of the dead, and the ability to commune with forces beyond comprehension. One such seeker was a man named Elias, an occult scholar obsessed with uncovering the truths hidden by time. He had heard rumors of *a mascara do paver for years, but had never been able to track it down. Until now, an ancient map had led him to the outskirts of the abandoned village, and from there, he had pieced together the final clues. Elias stood at the edge of the fog, staring at the silhouette of the mansion in the distance. His heart thudded in his chest, excitement and fear mingling in equal measure. He had come prepared, or so he thought, armed with talismans, incantations, and every bit of knowledge he had gleaned about the mask's dark history. He knew the dangers, of course, but Elias was not easily deterred. The lure of forbidden knowledge was too great, too intoxicating to resist. As he crossed the threshold of the iron gates, a chill ran through his body, though the air was unnaturally warm. The fog seemed to thicken around him, muffling the world, cutting him off from anything beyond the mansion's oppressive presence. The house itself loomed ahead, larger and more foreboding than he had imagined. Its cracked windows seemed to watch him, and the door, ajar, as if waiting for him, creaked on its rusted hinges. Elias stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the decaying halls. The scent of mold and rot filled his nostrils. But beneath it, there was something worse, a sweet, metallic tang that reminded him of blood. He swallowed hard, steadying himself. This was no time for hesitation. The mansion's interior was as decrepit as he had expected, but there was something else here. A presence. He could feel it lurking, watching him from the shadows. As he moved deeper into the house, Elias began to notice the faintest sound, like whispers, soft and indistinct, just on the edge of hearing. He couldn't make out the words, but their tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting. He found his way to the grand foyer, where the pedestal stood. His breath caught in his throat. There it was, the mask. The stories hadn't done it justice. Asterisk a mascara du paver asterisk was more than an object of horror. It asterisk exuded asterisk malevolence, its twisted surface gleaming in the dim light. Elias hesitated for the briefest of moments, but the hunger for knowledge, his insatiable need to understand, overcame the warning bells in his mind. Without another thought, Elias reached out and lifted the mask. The weight of it surprised him. It was heavier than he had expected, almost as if it resisted being moved. But he held it firmly, studying the intricate carvings and the unnatural smoothness of the metal. For a moment, he felt powerful, as if the mask was whispering to him, telling him things, ancient secrets. But then, as he prepared to place it on his face, a movement from the corner of his eye stopped him cold. There, standing in the shadows, was Raphael. But the man was no longer human. His body was gaunt, twisted, his eyes hollow and lifeless behind the mask. Blood dripped from beneath it, pooling at his feet, and his fingers twitched unnaturally. Raphael stepped forward, his voice a hollow rasp. Asterisk, you will not leave. Asterisk. Elias's heart raced. The mask was not just cursed, it was alive. Elias felt a cold wave of terror wash over him as Raphael stepped into the dim light. The mask on Raphael's face pulsated with a dark, otherworldly energy, its grotesque features seeming to shift and twist with every breath the creature took. But this wasn't just a mask anymore. It had become part of Raphael, fused with his very being, warping him into something beyond human. Asterisk, you will not leave. Asterisk, Raphael repeated, his voice no longer his own. It was a hollow, disembodied sound, as if the mask itself was speaking through him. The blood that trickled from beneath the mask began to quicken, staining the floor, pooling around Raphael's feet like a growing shadow. Elias took a step back, his mind racing. He had studied this moment for years, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. The talismans in his pocket, the incantations he had memorized, felt utterly useless in the face of this horror. All his knowledge, all his preparation, now seemed like nothing more than empty words in the presence of true malevolence. He clutched the mask in his hands, feeling its cold surface press into his skin. The weight of it was unbearable, as if the mask itself was trying to sink into him, to merge with him like it had with Raphael. The whispers around him grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears with a chaotic chorus of voices, all pleading, screaming, and mocking at once. Raphael took another step closer, his limbs jerking with unnatural movements, as if he were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. The blood at his feet rippled, dark tendrils snaking outward toward Elias, hungry for flesh. Asterisk, put it on. Asterisk, Raphael hissed, the words slithering into Elias's mind like a command. For a moment, Elias was tempted. The mask promised answers, power beyond his wildest dreams. Visions of the future, knowledge of the dead. He could feel its pull, its cold fingers wrapping around his mind, filling him with a terrible longing. If he just wore the mask, maybe he could control it. Maybe he could master its power where others had failed. But then, in the pit of his stomach, Elias felt the truth. The mask didn't offer power. It offered only endless suffering. The visions weren't gifts. They were curses, a gateway to unimaginable horrors. And once worn, the mask would never let go. Raphael, or what was left of him, was already too far gone. The man was no longer in control. He was just another victim, trapped inside his own mind, reliving his worst fears for eternity. That was the mask's true nature, to feed off fear, to imprison souls in a never-ending nightmare. Elias staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let the mask consume him. He had to end this, now. With all the strength he could muster, Elias hurled the mask across the room. It hit the far wall with a sickening crack, the sound echoing through the mansion. For a moment, the whispers stopped. The air grew still. Even Raphael paused, his twisted form swaying as if something inside him had been momentarily broken. But the reprieve was short-lived. The mask slid down the wall, landing with a dull thud on the floor, and the shadows around it began to swirl, as if drawn to it. The whispers returned, louder now, angrier. The mask asterisk wanted asterisk to be worn, and it would not be denied. Elias turned and ran. He sprinted through the decaying halls, the walls seeming to close in on him, the air thick with the scent of blood and rot. The mansion was alive with the mask's malevolence, every shadow stretching toward him, every creak of the floorboards a reminder that he was not alone. Behind him, he could hear Raphael's heavy, unsteady footsteps, growing faster, more frantic. The sound was joined by the chorus of voices, hundreds of them, pleading, screaming, laughing. The front doors loomed ahead, just a few steps away. Elias threw himself at them, bursting through into the cold night air. The fog greeted him like a wall, thick and suffocating, but it was better than what lay inside. He didn't stop running. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he kept going, the distant sound of Raphael's pursuit fading into the darkness behind him. The village was a blur of shadows and broken buildings, but Elias didn't look back. He couldn't. The mask remained in the mansion, waiting. It had always been patient. Days later, the mansion stood silent once more, the fog still curling around its ancient walls. The mask lay where Elias had thrown it, untouched. But it wasn't forgotten. Its whispers, though faint, still echoed through the halls, calling out to the next lost soul who would be drawn by its promises. In time, someone would come, someone desperate enough, broken enough, to believe the mask's lies. And when they did, asterisk a mascara to paver asterisk would be ready. The mask always waited, and it always won.